does this work?
Controllers. What are they good for? If you don't have a giant hunk of plastic, then nothing. But if you're a plastic-loving consumer like me, then they're one of the most important parts of your gaming collection. Just like everything else in the world, there are good controllers and bad controllers. Some are perfect in every way, with silky smooth bumpers and beautiful sticks, and others aren't. As an avid gamer with objectively correct opinions, I know exactly what makes a good controller. What makes a good controller, you may ask? Well, just watch and learn. I believe that there are two types of controllers. Some are meant to be generalists, built to tackle any problem in any game. 2 sticks, 2 triggers, 2 bumpers, face buttons, and a D-pad are the makings of a good generalist controller. Xbox and PlayStation are good examples of the stand-up citizens who keep their controllers logical and consistent. Sure, when making their controllers, they might add a few gimmicks like trigger stops, gyro controls, or haptic triggers. But at the end of the day, these controllers are very bare bones. You give your grandpa one of these, and he'll spend more time figuring out what the hell 2 boxes and 3 lines means rather than actually playing the game. When making a controller, you could be like them, or you could throw a bunch of random bullshit into the controller and hope for the best. A great example of this is anything made by Nintendo. 3 prongs, a useless C-stick, a detachable hunk of plastic, a whole-ass iPad. I like to call these types of controllers specialists. They are not made for most games. With wacky button layouts and out-of-the-box features, if game devs don't know how to properly utilize the hardware of these controllers, the games on their respective consoles can become really unfun to control. My favorite example of this is the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. Being simply shaped and packed with state-of-the-art motion controls, the Wii Remote is amazing for any game that is optimized for it. Your grandpa isn't going to have any trouble using this bad boy to play Wii Sports, that's for sure. However, this thing is terrible for use in any normal game, in my opinion at least. I believe that Super Mario Galaxy is one of the worst controlling 3D Mario games other than Sunshine because of this controller. I think the use of motion controls for the spin is annoying, and oftentimes it feels like Mario isn't going in the direction that I want him to go in. Tangent aside, specialist controllers have to be used right. Otherwise, you end up making the player shake a for one of the game's most important moves. As you can tell, I'm very opinionated about this topic. My opinion on a good controller is very cut and dry. I don't want some whack hunk of plastic in my hands that has a cavalry of useless buttons. I want something simple and intuitive, with a few gimmicks to make the games that utilize them more impactful. Which is why generalist controllers are my personal favorite. Now you may be thinking, oh Jacob, you're just describing the PS5 Shut up! The button layout matters too. I grew up an Xbox kid. My brother had a 360 he would let me play Minecraft on, and for the Christmas of 2016, my dad gave me an Xbox One. Technically, I was also going to get a PS4 for my grandpa that Christmas, but when he learned that I got an Xbox One from my dad, he decided to give it to my brother, which is only fair. Plus, now I get to flex on him with all of my new plastic. What I'm leading this to is I'm a big fan of the Xbox controller layout. Every single thing is perfect. I love the sticks, I love the buttons, I love the bumpers, I love the triggers, I love everything. However, I can put my love aside and admit that the Xbox controllers have some flaws. For example, the controllers are very basic. Although the Series XS controller is very well made and perfect for some classic gaming, the highest tech feature in this thing is the rumble. When compared to its main competitor, the PS5 controller, it's clear that it could use some extra features. However, this comes at a good cost. The cost! This bad boy is only like $50. Although you shouldn't break your controllers, you don't have to fret if your best friend chews one of these up. But if this little dummy chewed on my PS5 controller, he'd be put in the stew. The Elite Series 2 controller kinda fixes this with its higher build quality, customizable buttons, back paddles, and trigger stops. However, all of this adds up to a whopping price of... However, used controllers are available at much better prices. However, This controller is infamous for having a unique issue for every person who buys it. For me, the left stick had a misaligned sensor that I couldn't figure out how to fix until very recently. So if you're gonna buy one of these controllers, make sure to buy one that has zero issues. If modern Xbox controllers didn't have these problems, then they would easily be the best on the market. Unfortunately though, they don't. Which is why I'll swallow my pride and admit that these controllers are on par with the PS5 controller.
So yeah, I'm going to have to say that the amazing Giga Chad, super cool Series X controller goes into S tier, and it's just as good in my opinion. The big poopy dumb stupid stinky fart dumb PS5 controller will be joining it in S tier.
That thing's haptic triggers and gyro controls make it my go-to for certain games. In fact, I have a great example of the PS5 controller being used to its absolute fullest in a game. I recently played through the Resident Evil 4 remake, and it was amazing. I'll go more in depth on why I love that game so much in another video, but just know I played the PS5 version of the game. After playing through this masterpiece, I learned that it was one of the best games at utilizing the PS5 controller's features to its absolute fullest, other than Astro's Playroom. All of the guns and weapons have different haptic trigger thresholds, making me feel fully immersed in combat. Many sound effects come from the controller's speaker, like the attache case opening and the radio transmissions. And the speaker is loud and clear enough that it doesn't sound like it has a smoking problem like the Wii remote. One moment that used this feature in the game that gave me the chills was when, spoilers, Leon carries Ashley to the surgery room to cure her parasite when he faces a ton of hallucinations. Sadler's voice taunts you throughout the whole sequence, but his voice suddenly switched to the controller's speaker.
Still you resist, child.
It scared the out of me. Games like Resident Evil 4 are what put the PlayStation 5 controller up there with the Series XS controller as one of my two favorite controllers of all time. But imagine a world where controllers weren't this simple. Let's have a thought experiment. Imagine a world with no Generalist controllers. Xbox and PlayStation are dead, and you have to use a wacky hunk of plastic to play your shooter game. What would be the best options? In my correct opinion, there are two options for this hellscape reality. One is pretty obvious, and I feel like most gamers would agree with me. The other, though, most people would think is a little wacky. Let's go over the first, and probably better option. The GameCube controller. This controller, made for the GameCube, is a little bit of a whack job. With angled notches, a wacky button layout, and a tooth for a right stick, this controller is very original. This would make you assume it would be pretty rough to use for most games. That isn't true though. The GameCube controller has all the buttons needed to play modern day games, minus the left bumper. It's effectively a modern day Xbox controller on an acid trip. Plus, this third-party GameCube controller I used for my Switch was built to have a left bumper and extra face buttons, making it usable for all kinds of games. The button layout of this controller may seem daunting at first, but remember, in this hypothetical, this is the only controller used for games now, so games would be optimized to use this controller's button layout. With some simple button remapping, games like Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, and many other non-Nintendo games would be fully playable on a GameCube controller. Now, the other option. This controller is a bit wacky. It has a traditional button layout, but it has a multitude of features that make its form factor a little goofy, and its size reprimandable. This controller is notorious for being really f***ing expensive and not worth the effort. But when you really think about it, this controller can be used for almost anything. And its special features, if used properly, can greatly enhance one's gaming experience. What is this silly controller, you may be wondering? Well, it's none other than the Wii U gamepad. Think about it, and I mean really think about it. 2 sticks, bumpers, triggers, face buttons, and a D-pad. This thing can play any game! What makes it a specialist controller, though? The screen on the Wii U is a very divisive feature. If a dev is creative, they can use it in ways that make a game unique, intuitive, and fun. If a dev doesn't do that, though, you end up having to look down at your controller every 3 minutes to do some mundane task rather than just pulling up a menu on the TV. Remember, the Wii U wasn't a failure because it was a bad console with a bad controller. It was a failure because Nintendo was terrible at advertising it, and permanently screwed the public image of the console. If Nintendo gave the Wii U a better game selection that utilized the controller's capabilities to their fullest, it would have been one of their best consoles. But instead we live in a world where all of the best Wii U games just got ported to Switch. Where am I leading this, you may ask? Well, I think the Wii U is kinda neat, and I think that the controller wouldn't be that bad to use for most games. If we lived in a world where the only controller was the Wii U gamepad, the biggest problems we would have is the controller being a little too big, the controller being way too expensive, and World War III.
Get to the chopper.
Now, what have we learned from this little thought experiment? It's that specialist controllers, like the Wii U gamepad and GameCube controller, would be perfectly fine for most modern games if they just had a few tweaks. If a controller meets the criteria of having 2 sticks, 2 bumpers, 2 triggers, and enough face buttons to have a feast, then it will work as well as you need it to. Okay, while writing this video, I was originally going to make it about building the ideal controller, until I realized that my answer is way simpler than I originally thought. Yeah, like I said earlier, the Xbox Series XS controller and the PS5 controller are kind of just peak. If I could have an Xbox controller button layout with the PS5's haptic triggers and touchpad and such, I would swoon. Honestly though, I don't think we should have a perfect controller. I'm perfectly happy with the way companies design their controllers now. When a controller is made for a specific console, it feels more special, more unique. All the details of the controller feel fine-tuned for what the company wants to make with their games. If the Nintendo Switch just used a basic Xbox controller and didn't have the option for Joy-Cons, I feel like a good amount of games would lose their charm and feel on that console. In fact, if every game used the same controller, they would all end up feeling like one of those pirated consoles that you find on Amazon for $10. I love controllers. They're one of my favorite parts about gaming, and without them, all of my plastic would be useless. Just ignore the fact that keyboard and mouse is way better. I think I'm getting the hang of this.